on steel and aluminum entering the U.S. from 25% to 50% is undoubtedly going to cause some concern. We plan to hike it by 25% to 50%. The cost of making carbonated drinks in the U.S. increased by an unprecedented 18% in the first quarter of 2025. The steepest quarterly increase in almost 30 years due to tariffs on steel entering the U.S. American workers in American factories make most of the drinks in the U.S. The White House's decision to impose a 50% tariff on imported aluminum, a policy move intended to revive domestic metal production, but with immediate and far-reaching ripple effects across the consumer goods sector, is directly responsible for this sharp increase in production costs. The first significant casualties of this policy shift are about 40% of Coca-Cola's U.S.-based production will switch from aluminum cans to plastic bottles, the business announced in a statement issued in March. The explanation is straightforward. Political actions far removed from grocery store shelves are now threatening canned packing, which was once a dependable and iconic format for the beverage giant. As aluminum prices skyrocketed, so did retail prices, making canned packaging financially unsustainable in the short term, depending on regional distributor contracts and packaging expenses. A typical 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola, which used to retail for 99 cents, can now sell for anywhere between $1.09 and $1.15. Consumers have begun to notice that sales of Coca-Cola cans have decreased by 2% in April, according to large national retailers like Walmart and Target. This is a clear indication that consumers are resisting price increases or switching to alternative packaging formats like plastic bottles and multi-use containers. The pressure is further increased by a growing shortage of aluminum cans in important distribution states like Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, as domestic aluminum production is unable to meet demand in the near future. Coca-Cola, a business founded on scale and operational efficiency, has started importing plastic bottle stock from plants in Mexico and Canada in order to maintain. Millions of U.S. consumers are already experiencing the effects of this abrupt logistical shift, which is costly and disruptive. What was once a simple supply chain for a common American product is now entangled in an intensifying trade war. Coca-Cola is not the only company suffering from the effects of the aluminum tariff, as evidenced by the increased cost of a chilled can of the beverage. PepsiCo and Keurig, Dr. Pepper have also reported comparable increases in production costs. These companies also rely significantly on imported aluminum for canned drinks, a packaging format that has up until now dominated shelf space in American grocery stores, according to financial analysts monitoring sector performance. The wider impact on the carbonated beverage industry has been swift and significant. In the first quarter of 2025, the U.S. soft drink market lost almost $1.5 billion in market capitalization, which is not just a paper loss but also reflects waning investor confidence in an industry that is now forced to make expensive supply chain pivots in real time as costs rise and margins shrink. Some beverage manufacturers are beginning to consider more extreme alternatives, cutting back on their stock-keeping units for SACOs based on aluminum. For smaller companies that lack the funds to retool for alternatives made of plastic or glass, these tariffs could be a tipping point. American customers may soon have fewer options on store shelves, particularly when it comes to reasonably priced, single-serve canned drinks for a generation that grew up popping open a cool can of soda. This isn't just about business, it's about access. What started as a tariff policy to protect American metal is now exposing the delicate interdependence of global supply chains and domestic consumption. And with each passing week, the costs are getting harder to contain for both businesses and regular consumers. These changes may seem like more than just an economic shift. They also signal a cultural one. Early in January 2025, the Trump campaign, reverting to its hardline economic agenda, announced a dramatic escalation in trade protectionism, a 50% tariff on imported aluminum, up from the previous 25% introduced during Trump's first term. Although the measure was marketed as part of a larger strategy to revive domestic industry and reduce dependence on foreign supply chains, its immediate impact was far more disruptive than productive. This marked the beginning of the aluminum crisis that is currently reverberating through the American beverage industry. The Canadian imports of aluminum were explicitly targeted by the levy. Three nations that together provide the majority of the raw materials used in beverage packaging in the United States are China, Mexico, and the inclusion of Canadian imports in the new tariff scheme caught industry groups off guard, as Canada is a crucial and historically dependable source of high-grade aluminum, particularly for the food and beverage sector. Several analysts warned that penalizing a key trade ally could backfire, raising costs without improving domestic resilience. The U.S. aluminum industry now lacks the infrastructure, labor, and investment necessary to replace imports at volume. For beverage giants like Coca-Cola, the tariff has so far revealed the weaknesses of intricately linked global supply chains, where disruption in one segment, like aluminum, can affect entire sectors. For millions of American consumers, the fallout has already started to manifest in the form of higher prices and fewer options available on the shelf, as aluminum prices spiked and production costs increased in early 2025. Coca-Cola acknowledged that persistent rises in input costs, particularly for aluminum, particularly those related to transportation and aluminum. One of the most noticeable changes has been the increase in the usage of PET plastic bottles. Plastic, which is exempt from the aluminum tariff, provides a less expensive packaging option, but at the expense of Coca-Cola's reputation, goes against the company's long-term sustainability objectives and is already drawn in order to re-import finished goods into the U.S. at a lower overall cost. Coca-Cola is investigating expanding its packaging operations outside of the U.S. by manufacturing and canning drinks in nations exempt from the new aluminum tariffs. Although this workaround adds more logistical complexity, it might provide short-term. Analysts suggest that Coca-Cola may also scale back some domestic production to reduce its exposure to tariff-related cost volatility. While the company has not publicly confirmed plant closures or layoffs, its supply chain strategy is clearly evolving in response to shifting trade dynamics. Once a textbook example of U.S. East-based manufacturing and global brand reach, Coca-Cola now finds itself adapting to a geopolitical landscape where policy, not just consumer demand, shapes operational decisions for a company that sells nearly 2 billion servings a day. The stakes couldn't be higher. The core issue behind this policy failure is structural. The U.S. does not produce enough aluminum to meet its own industrial demand, especially in packaging. As of 2025, domestic smelting covers only about 35% of consumption. The rest is filled by imports, particularly from Canada, which supplies high-grade aluminum for food and beverage use. Targeting Canada with tariffs created a costly gap that U.S. infrastructure simply can't fill, as experts note scaling up smelting capacity would take 3 to 5 years and billions in investment, meaning manufacturers and consumers must absorb the immediate shock. Over half of the remaining supply has long been supplied by imports, mainly from Canada, which offers large quantities of high-grade aluminum with no geopolitical risk. For companies like Coca-Cola, which mainly depend on reliable and affordable Canadian imports to maintain their operations, Canada's inclusion in the new 50% tariff policy is particularly perplexing because it is not only geographically close, but also a long-standing trading partner. Under frameworks like USMCA, formerly NAFTA, it takes more than just flicking a switch to increase domestic aluminum capacity. This supply gap is why tariff policies intended to encourage American behavior may end up driving costs higher for industries that have no viable short-term domestic alternative, such as Coca-Cola, which operate on a massive global scale but rely on tight local margins. Establishing or expanding aluminum smelting facilities in the U.S. typically takes 3 to 5 years and requires billions of dollars in capital investment, not to mention environmental permitting, skilled labor, and energy-intensive infrastructure. Without a coordinated plan to increase domestic production or provide targeted exemptions for essential imports, as we have already seen, consumers and businesses alike will pay the price as the